I want to take a few minutes to talk about power and influence and kind of provide some concluding thoughts here. Something to think about when we talk about power and influence is why are we even talking about it? What's the purpose behind it? Why do we want you to learn about it? How are we bringing that to use? Why do leaders need to understand the roles of social power and influence? And ultimately, it's about thinking about and being intentional about the types of outcomes that you want. Now, remember our model where the leader is, and then the leader behaves in certain ways. And we can think of influence tactics as a leader behavior. And then we get follower behaviors in reaction to those influence tactics or those other leader behaviors, and that leads to our leadership outcomes. We need to think about those follower behaviors and what kind of behaviors are going to get us to the kind of outcomes that we want. And in particular, we're looking for followers to just meet the letter of the law, to do the minimum required effort to get things done and to follow our orders? Or do we want them to be truly committed to what we want, to be willing to go above and beyond? And if we think about our leaders, we can think about certain leaders we had who were and for whom we are willing to go above and beyond, who we would follow to the gates of heck and back, follow them into battle anytime because we just respect them and we understand them and we are committed to them and their cause. That's really what we're talking about here. That difference versus just doing enough because you ordered me to and there's a chain of command and so I'm going to do it. That's where we're talking about those follower reactions to leader behaviors. And so understanding those influence tactics is part of that, but also the power relationships. So when we talk about social power, we're talking about a relationship. This is an aspect of the situation that leaders need to consider when they're deciding what behaviors to engender. That social power really comes from a relationship with another person. So I have different kinds of power with different people, right? I have different power between my wife and I than I do between my daughter, but then I do between some of my coworkers, I do between my boss. There's different power, and those types of power are going to come to the fore differently depending on who I'm working with and frankly, the kinds of behaviors that they're enacting. And then I'm going to choose, if I'm the leader here, in order to influence a follower, in order to achieve certain kinds of behavior, I will use those influence tactics. So let me dive into this just a little bit more. Again, I'm talking about when we're talking about outcomes, and we're talking about follower behaviors in terms of achieving those outcomes. We want to think about commitment versus compliance. Where compliance is doing something because you were told to do it, it's about the minimum effort, just I'm doing it because you asked me to, and that's all I'm going to do. Versus commitment about doing something because you want to do it, about being motivated and putting extra into it and going above and beyond. Now, look, I say all this, and I've talked about the commitment is kind of that great leader that we all want to follow, but sometimes compliance is enough, and we need to be conscious of what we're trying to achieve. In particular, in the military, we are often asking people to do things that they really don't want to do. Sometimes it's as simple as staying late. Sometimes it's cleaning up after someone else. Sometimes it's putting themselves into harm's way or doing things that go against certain codes of morality that we might have to do on the battlefield. And look, I'm not talking about acting unethically, but I am talking about sometimes we have to order someone else to kill someone. And that's a difficult thing. And sometimes compliance is really what we need in that situation, even over and above commitment. Would we like to get commitment? Absolutely. That helps people to really be aligned with us and to go above and beyond. But sometimes commitment might be a bridge too far, and we really just need to get to compliance. So some things to think about just in terms of being intentional, being conscious of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So we have these sources of social power, we have these influence tactics, and each of these represent pieces of our process of leadership. The sources of social power are come out of the relationship, and they really are an aspect of the situation. Influence tactics can be thought of as a leader behavior, the tactics that we use with our followers or with others in order to try and achieve leadership results, achieve follower reactions and leadership results. I would also say that this is a situational aspect. the content of the ask, the content of the order matters as well. So sometimes explain to someone why something is important. When we feel like we are working on an important, essential task, we are more likely to be committed to it. And certainly, I think it goes without saying, when we are working on an enjoyable task, if it's a pleasant task, then we're going to be more committed to it. So asking people, explaining to people the importance of tasks, and then making sure that even if we're not making it, fun and interesting, at least we're taking the really bad stuff away and making sure that people can do their jobs. That can be an important part of engendering commitment as well. So ultimately, if you want commitment, a couple of things. Number one, the influence tactics that tend to lead to commitment: consultation, inspirational appeals, absolutely. Rational persuasion when it's really good rational persuasion, right? It can't be mailed in. And definitely not pressure tactics. Pressure tactics always lead to compliance, not commitment. Again, the content being essential and enjoyable, and sometimes it takes a little bit of extra explaining to someone why. And then the source of power that best leads to commitment is, of course, reference power. And look, I suggest in this last slide, when we think about reference power, it's not just about friendship. There is this likability to it, but it's also about the prestige and respect. So sometimes just being an officer brings its own level of reference power when someone sees you as that idealized officer and that idealized leader. When you chip away at that, that actually chips away at your referent power. So I do have a last thought about this idea of referent power and legitimate power. Because we are a military organization, and because the use of force is inherent in everything that we do, or at least a possibility in what we do, it's really important that a chain of command be in place, and that the opportunity to use legitimate power and legitimating tactics in order to get compliance is absolutely important. It can be really easy to slip into this idea that referent power should rule everything. And look, referent power is really important. Legitimate power tends to hurt our relationship. The use of referent power is either neutral or builds our relationship. And so we want to lean on referent power to the extent that we can. The problem with using referent power too much is if we're willing to give up legitimate power in order to gain referent power, then that's a problem. This, for example, is the problem with fraternization. Fraternization is an issue where we start to lose legitimate power because people no longer respect each other and the chain of command within that. And it's very easy to do to give up referent power. This is why we put so much emphasis on owning the orders that you are given. Why even when you disagree with an order that's given from above, that you own it as your own. If you walk into a situation and say, look, guys, I don't really want to do this, but the boss told me we have to, and so that's the way it's going to be. What happens there is you lose a little bit of legitimate power. Because now your boss has legitimate power. And guess what? All of your legitimate power comes from that relationship with the boss and the fact that you are speaking on behalf of your commander. That's where your legitimate power comes from. It doesn't come from nowhere. And so when you give that up and say, I'm not really speaking for the commander, I'm speaking for you as my friends, yes, will that build your referent power in the short run? Yeah, it may very well. On the other hand, it's going to affect your legitimate power. And when we talk about compliance and achieving compliance, referent power is actually very hard for achieving compliance. And sometimes, like I said earlier, we need compliance over and above commitment. Sometimes it's even more important than commitment and harder to get. And in those cases, we really need to be able to hold on to our legitimate power in order to achieve it. So those are just some broad thoughts about power and influence and how we should look at it through the lens of military leadership.